Okay, this is part 3 of the 4.12 lesson, and we're going to go through the online activity, the Civil Rights Movement. Welcome to 1964 and the Trailways bus station in Washington, D.C. Dwight D. Eisenhower is president. The Korean War ended last year. Radio stations are starting to play a new kind of music, rock and roll. On the waterfront, starring Marlon Brando is playing in movie theaters. People are watching for UFOs, wearing blue jeans and poodle skirts, and laughing along with the characters in I Love Lucy. But all is not well in America. Washington, D.C., 1954. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words from the Declaration of Independence rang hollow for millions of African Americans denied political, economic, educational, and social equality by unjust laws and social customs. It has been 7 years since 16 young men boarded a bus to challenge segregation laws in the South. Since then, the NAACP has shifted its focus to fighting segregation in public schools. The organized struggle for racial equality in America is gaining momentum. You will take a trip back through time and across America to review some of the key events of the Civil Rights Movement. It's time to board the bus. The Supreme Court case of Morgan v. Virginia in 1946 made state laws requiring the segregation of white and black passengers unconstitutional. If you were headed north, you probably wouldn't see blacks and whites sitting in separate sections of the bus. Passengers on buses traveling through the South, however, are often segregated despite the court's ruling. Civil rights activists are trying to end this kind of racial segregation. In the 1950s, school segregation was widely accepted throughout the nation. Some states actually required segregated schools. In 1952, the Supreme Court heard several cases involving school segregation. In 1954, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case Brown v. Board of Education. Travel to the city where Linda Brown and others challenged the doctrine of separate but equal, and that is Topeka, Kansas. Correct. The local chapter of the NAACP in Topeka, Kansas helped a group of 13 parents file a class action lawsuit against the Board of Education of Topeka schools. The case eventually went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and now the court is handing down its ruling. Here it is. The court ruled unanimously that the separate but equal clause from Plessy v. Ferguson is unconstitutional because it violates the children's 14th Amendment rights. That's right. The court ruled that the separate but equal clause from Plessy v. Ferguson was unconstitutional because it violated the children's 14th Amendment rights by separating them according to the color of their skin. Although the court ruled that separate but equal was unconstitutional, change did not come immediately, nor did it come without a fight. In a campaign known as Massive Resistance, Southern congressmen resisted the move toward desegregation. Now it's time to travel to 1955 to the city where Rosa Parks refuses to give up her bus seat to a white man, and that would be Montgomery, Alabama. Welcome to Montgomery. There will be a lot of civil rights activity in Alabama. It begins when a 43-year-old black woman named Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat near the front of the bus to a white man. The police arrive and arrest Parks. The city buses are segregated in Montgomery. By law, blacks must give their seats to whites. Her arrest prompts 50 leaders of the black community to meet and discuss the arrest. The leaders decide to organize a boycott of the buses. That's right, the residents of Montgomery launch a bus boycott. Soon afterward, they elect a young pastor by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., president of the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association. The boycott continues into 1956, and King gains national prominence for his role in the boycott. The boycott works. In December, the Supreme Court rules that Alabama's segregation laws are unlawful, and Montgomery buses must desegregate. Brown v. Board of Education. The Montgomery bus boycott. The Supreme Court has ruled that segregation is unconstitutional, but in the face of 100 years of prejudice and racial inequality, change comes slowly. But it does come, and now it's time to travel 2 years forward in time to a city where a high school is set to begin the 57-58 school year as a desegregated school. This is going to be Little Rock, Arkansas. You've reached Little Rock, Arkansas. It's September 3rd, the first day of school. 9 black students arrive at Little Rock High School, but Arkansas National Guardsmen in a crowd intent on keeping the school segregated prevent their entry. On September 23rd, the students return, but another large mob turns them away. Finally, the President of the United States intervenes, sending 1,000 U.S. Army paratroopers to Little Rock. On September 25th, the black students return, and escorted and protected by the federal troops finally enter Little Rock High School, the Little Rock Nine. Which president sent federal troops to Little Rock to enforce integration? That would be Dwight Eisenhower there in the middle. Correct. President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock to enforce school desegregation. Some white Southerners characterize Eisenhower's deployment of federal troops as a second invasion, the first one being the Civil War and Reconstruction. This characterization was often repeated in later years. Accordingly, segregationists were just as hostile and confrontational with the federal soldiers and marshals as they were with black students. 3 years later, in 1960, the sit-in protest movement begins at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and spreads across the nation. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality sent student volunteers on freedom rides, bus trips across the South to challenge segregation in bus terminals. These nonviolent protesters, both black and white, encounter violence at many stops. A year later, amid protests and riots, James Meredith becomes the first African American to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Slowly and against great odds, the civil rights movement gains momentum. Now travel 6 years into the future to a city where a massive protest march is scheduled for August 28, 1963, to support pending civil rights legislation. Martin Luther King Jr. will be delivering an important speech during the event, and that's going to be in D.C. You have arrived in the nation's capital. Civil rights activists are hoping that Congress will pass legislation to guarantee racial equality. The March on Washington is taking place here. In front of the Lincoln Memorial and a crowd of more than 200,000 peaceful marchers, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is delivering a powerful speech. He speaks of his dream to see the day when his 4 little children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And then, if you want, you can play the speech there, but I'm just going to keep going ahead. King, who like Gandhi believes in nonviolence, says in his speech, "Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle in the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence." What do you think of a person who can make that plea in spite of the hatred and violence directed toward him and others simply because their skin was a different color? Did the March on Washington have any effect? Well, the next year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What was the purpose of that legislation? And it outlawed discrimination in employment and public facilities. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in employment and public facilities. It also allowed the federal government to withhold federal funds from any state public program that discriminated on the basis of race. Although the Civil Rights Act had been signed into law, civil rights leaders continued to push for further reforms. In the Freedom Summer Campaign of 1964, SNCC and CORE sent thousands of young people, most of them white, to Mississippi. The goal was to register hundreds of thousands of black voters. Organizers also set up the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which sent a delegation to the Democratic National Convention. Unfortunately, not all civil rights protests were peaceful. Your next stop is 2 years later and back in the South. Your destination is a place where police stop peaceful protest marchers who were on their way to Montgomery to support voting rights. The incident there can be known as Bloody Sunday, and that's going to be in Selma, Alabama. You've made it to Selma, Alabama, about 40 miles west of Montgomery, the state capital. It's Sunday, March 7, 1965, and Martin Luther King Jr. was planning to lead a march from Selma to Montgomery. Governor Wallace is refusing to allow the march, and King has just decided to delay it and go to Washington, D.C. to speak to President Johnson. The marchers, impatient with their desire for voting rights, begin the march anyway. When they reach the city limits at the Pettius Bridge, they are stopped by a police blockade. The police order the marchers to disperse. Without waiting for the marchers to obey their orders, police attack the protesters using tear gas, whips, and clubs. Dozens are injured. The incident receives national media attention and is dubbed Bloody Sunday. President Johnson intervenes, so King is finally able to lead a successful demonstration march on March 25th. Angry about the way the protesters were treated, Johnson gives a stirring speech to Congress about civil rights. President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What does this law do? It gave blacks the right to vote in primaries. Oh, that's not it. It made it easier for blacks to, sorry. It made it easier for blacks to vote in the South. How embarrassing. By removing obstacles such as literacy tests and poll taxes, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 made it easier for Southern blacks to register to vote. Over the next 4 years, the number of black voters in the South increased to 3.1 million. An unintended consequence of the legislation was that the region's white majority shifted its allegiance to the Republican Party. Travel to the city where in August 1965 a routine traffic stop in a neighborhood called Watts sparked riots that lasted for 6 days, and that's going to be in Los Angeles. Welcome to Los Angeles, California, the city of angels. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed, states had moved quickly to get around the new federal law. California passed a law to block the fair housing section of the Civil Rights Act. That and other state actions made people believe they were being unjustly treated and created despair in inner cities. The Watts riots erupt. The riots last for 6 days and leave 34 people dead, more than 1,000 injured, and hundreds of buildings destroyed. The police arrest nearly 4,000 people. After the riots, Governor Brown forms a commission to study the riots. The commission reports concludes that the riots were not the act of thugs, but rather the result of much deeper problems, including the high jobless rate in the inner city, poor housing, and bad schools. Despite the report, no one makes any significant effort to address the problems. The Watts riots and riots that occur in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan 2 years later raise serious questions about the intertwined problems of race and poverty. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders begin to focus their attention on these problems. You have one more stop on your ride through the civil rights movement. Travel forward in time 3 years to the city where Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, and that is Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee, April 4th, 1968. While organizing the Poor People's Campaign, Martin Luther King Jr. has stopped in Memphis to show his support for striking sanitation workers. Yesterday, King addressed a crowd of workers. He encouraged them in their struggle for economic justice. The week before, King had marched with the striking sanitation workers. The march had turned violent. King had been furious. He urged the participants to call the march off, and he left. Now he has come back to lead a peaceful march. They've been planning it all day. The civil rights leader returns to his hotel room where he worries about the strike and works on a sermon for an upcoming church service. Around 5 p.m., King leaves his room. He and some close friends are going to get something to eat. He pauses on the balcony and a shot rings out. A bullet fired by escaped convict James Earl Ray strikes King. The civil rights leader is rushed to a Memphis hospital, but at 7:05 p.m., the doctors declare that Martin Luther King Jr. is dead. King's assassination had a tremendous effect on the nation. It also affected a major civil rights bill that was making its way through Congress. The wave of national remorse over King's death helped pass the bill in the House on April 10th. President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968 into law the next day. The bill was originally designed to extend U.S. government protection to civil rights workers, but was amended to prohibit discrimination on the sale, rental, and financing of housing. This legislation, often referred to as the Housing Rights Act of 1968, was the last of the 3 great civil rights acts of the 1960s. Well, you're back in D.C., where you started your ride through the civil rights movement. Much has happened in the last 14 years, and in some ways the struggle for equality is just getting started. The successes of the civil rights movement, however, incomplete and imperfect, have shown what can be accomplished by people acting out of conscience and with dedication to democratic ideals. Okay, and then we have the chapter highlights. Black veterans returned home from World War I to continued segregation and discrimination. Jackie Robinson and Brooklyn Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey integrated Major League Baseball. The Supreme Court ruled against separate but equal public schools in Brown v. Board of Education, beginning the slow process of desegregation. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama bus, beginning a boycott that blacks continued under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. President Eisenhower sent U.S. troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce the integration of Central High School over the opposition of the governor. Cord, James Farmer, and SNCC organized new freedom rides, and President Kennedy sent federal marshals to protect them. King was arrested in Birmingham, the nation's largest segregated city, and wrote his famous letter asserting the right to violate unjust laws. 250,000 people marched on Washington, D.C., where King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Okay, I might not get to all of this before we end my time runs out for the 15 minutes, but remember for the 4.12 quiz to review lesson 409, 410, and 412. Those are all be included there in your 4.12 quiz. Good luck on your quiz. Finish reading through the chapter highlights. I'm almost out of time. Good luck, everyone.